Welcome back. The next section of this lecture will provide an overview of the finance and policy challenges facing the Academy. This section aligns with the readings around the midpoint of the semester, in which, from a journal article perspective, we will dive into those factors that provide the historical foundation as well as the modern evolution of the change in the social compact with our nation's educational system. I contend that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, that our universities and colleges had a social compact with the nation in which it was the responsibility of states to fund the significant portion of operating costs. Now that social compact has been undermined as students and parents are looked to cover a greater cost of the operations of our institutions. But where do we find ourselves presently? Where do we find ourselves from an economic perspective here in 2016 as we're preparing for the start of the fall semester? The slide talks about how outside entities view our industry, those outside entities being bond rating groups, Moody's and Standard & Poor's. You see in the first slide that Moody's Investor Services notes the difficult financial future facing public colleges and universities. They see that flagship institutions have the positive ability to weather uncertain winds, but regional institutions and community colleges really are finding a situation in which their growth in expenses is outpacing their revenue growth, and those two different tracks are unsustainable. That finding is also reflected in the Standard & Poor's quote that's contained in Bullet 2. That states, unless colleges and institutions are able to distinguish themselves in the marketplace, that they will weaken their demand and cut into their enrollment over time. What you're seeing, ladies and gentlemen, is essentially the privatization of our nation's public system of education. We're also seeing, unfortunately, the closure of many public and private universities. Each week, if you pick up the Chronicle, you'll either see an article on downsizing or you see an article on institutional closure. In my former state of West Virginia Tech, located in Montgomery, has closed and relocated to Beckley in hopes of moving its location to a greater enrollment base. Mountain State University in Beckley has closed. And as you look across the country, you see with repeated frequency stories of small regional institutions, small private institutions closing because they're no longer able to sustain their place in the higher education market. This slide is a slide that I put together a long time ago for Dr. Rota when I was on his staff, and it's a slide that I've continued to update because it tracks over time that shift in the social compact for our state's institutions and for those states who comprise the members of the Southern Regional Education Board. The SREB, those 16 states, are outlined in blue. You can see that in 2001, about 66 cents on the dollar of what it took to run an institution in the SRB was provided by the taxpayers of those states. That number is 43 cents on the dollar for 2014. Here in the state of Tennessee, 61 cents on the dollar in 2000, now 39 cents on the dollar in 2013-14, and that number will continue to trend downward. So you really see the shift here, that paradigm shift of a public good to a private good being epitomized in the means through which states provide support for their system of post-secondary institutions. Here's that slide disaggregated for the 16 states who comprise the membership of the SREB. You can see that on average across the SREB, institutions have about $14,780 to run their operations. This is data for university sector institutions. Within the state of Tennessee, that number is $14,310. But you can compare and contrast the reliance upon different sectors of revenue by state. So North Carolina, which has historically supported its institutions from the state side, coming in at $9,500 per FTE and $6,000 per FTE in terms of net tuition revenue, contrasted against the state of South Carolina, who has really put all of their emphasis on the privatization side of the equation through tuition and fee revenues. I want to talk a little bit about how states support universities. I referenced in a prior section of the lecture Performance Funding 2.0, a system through which institutions are rewarded for outcomes. But this slide talks a little bit about how states have historically supported their colleges and universities. In the late 1960s, the state of Texas developed the Texas model, a model that rewarded institutions based on the number of students that were enrolled. Those students were weighted at different levels based upon CIP code, CIP codes, the taxonomy for the classification of academic programs, with the recognition that some programs, such as nursing and engineering, cost more than programs such as my discipline in political science. So Texas put together a mathematical model that provided recognition of differential weights, differential costs, differential class sizes, but then through that mathematical model was able to generate a predicted level of funding required to support the institutions within its state. That concept became the base for institutional funding across the nation, and for decades was the base through which institutional funding was provided within the state of Tennessee. However, as states began to realize their challenges of supporting that model, other models began to emerge. Within the state of Kentucky and then within West Virginia, they developed peer models in which an institution is compared to its funding peers, and then there's an aspirational target or a midpoint for which funding would be recommended, and that was the level of funding that would be provided to a university. So, for example, if the University of Kentucky's funding peers included UT, Florida, Ohio State, etc., you would take those 20 institutions, develop their overall per FTE state support, examine Kentucky in comparison to that level, and then the difference would be what the University of Kentucky would submit to the state in terms of a funding request. When I was in West Virginia, we had a similar model, a peer equity model, in which each institution had a peer target, and then I would go before the General Assembly each year and make a request to close that gap between the institution and its peers. That model on the surface worked because the primary driver of costs within higher education are the individuals who comprise the heart of the academy, our faculty and staff. So if 70% of your costs are related to faculty and staff salaries, that can be benchmarked against peers. If you are trailing peer institutions in terms of state support, then it's not a gigantic leap of faith to assume that you're trailing peer institutions in terms of faculty and staff salaries. So from a face validity perspective, this model held its own for the better part of 10 to 15 years. However, with the advent of the focus on completion, with groups such as the Lumina Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and others putting a significant policy access on completion, institutions led by the states of Indiana and Tennessee shifted their funding formulas, moving away from the old Texas model to develop a model predicated on outcomes. As you can see from the literature reference, the McKee-Moak article in 2009, 36 states used some form of funding guidelines to shape their allocation. And according to a Complete College Tennessee report in 2011, Indiana, Tennessee, West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky are developing new formulas, with Tennessee and Indiana taking the lead in this 2.0 funding paradigm and outcome. Here are the basic models of the funding formula within the state of Tennessee. Here are state appropriations for institutions in the UT, TBR, and community college systems across the state. And this chart to me is, I think, really powerful, and I would encourage you to spend some time with it, because what it shows is that just on the face value, the state has increased its investment in post-secondary education. I've highlighted East Tennessee State University, for example. So we received about $45 million in state support for the base aspects of the institution, not College of Medicine or our other affiliated health units, but for the base aspects of the university. In 2014-15, that number had increased by $3 million. Overall, you see about a $100 million increase in terms of support for the system over that time period. So from a layperson's perspective, they'd look at this chart and say, well, the state's investing more in higher education. What's missing from that, however, is the fact that that support is being utilized to supplement the education of more students. So as the system has grown, what we have witnessed is that level of support is actually diminishing over time. This is a chart that then Chancellor Morgan provided to the Board of Regents in the fall of 2014, where the Chancellor looked at all dollars in, state plus student-generated revenues. The blue bars represents ERA, the stimulus money that we received during the downturn. And what's for me is important to note here is that in 1986, the year that I was a freshman in college, the state had about $15,000 per student to support the operations of its universities. Now, in 2014, we have about $15,000 to support the operations of the universities. So even though from a raw dollar perspective, the state is investing more in its institutions, from an operational perspective, we, the faculty and staff at ETSU, you at your respective colleges, are essentially operating with a constant amount of dollars over a 30-year time period. So when we talk about affordability, when we talk about tuition and price increases, when we talk about state investments, you really have to preface that on a per student basis, because as enrollment has grown, it takes more faculty, it takes more staff, it takes a larger infrastructure to support that larger enrollment base. So shifting gears a little bit, let's talk some about price. So these slides hit on the state investment portion of the equation. Talk about price. Affordability is on the tips of anyone's tongue who has a child going to college, who they themselves are enrolled, or who they're preparing to send a child to college. This chart is a chart that's conveyed in public media all across the nation. An upward trend. With each passing year, college becomes more and more expensive. But what's complicated from a descriptive perspective is that in the community colleges, college somewhat is still affordable. College doesn't cost $36,000, which is the average price at a private institution, or it doesn't cost in excess of $60,000, which is what it would cost to send your son or daughter or yourself to George Washington University. The next slide shows in-state tuition and fees for those states that comprise the SREB. And you can see on average, those numbers are far below the significant dollar figures that you saw for private institutions. So in places like Tennessee, in the year reported here, $7,500 in tuition and fees. I know that the slide's a little dated, but it's the most recent information available from SREB, for which I have comparative lens to examine state-based tuition and fees. As a point of context, tuition at ETSU this fall is $8,500. Here you see Tennessee compared to SREB data, but here's the other end of the coin, affordability. You can see the purchasing power of the Pell over time. So as we've increased tuition and fees, the purchasing power of Pell has not been able to maintain pace with fee increases. As a result, more students are borrowing. At our university, almost 40% of the students who graduate with debt, and that average debt load is $23,000 per year. In terms of the amount that students borrow each year, you can see within the state of Tennessee, the average student borrows about $4,600 per year to help offset the cost of college. But a point that I alluded to earlier with respect to ETSU data is now conveyed here with respect to the state of Tennessee as a whole. 41% of the students who enrolled in our state's post-secondary system are Pell recipients. So we must be mindful of tuition and fees as we look to that issue of balancing access, the first public priority of higher education, with affordability, the environmental lens through which this portion of the lecture is covering. So I'm going to pause for a second, take a break, and then come back and touch upon ways through which institutions, be they community colleges or universities, can look to examine aspects to realize cost savings. So I look forward to you joining me in the next section of the lecture. Thank you.